Stranded with a stranger. It started with my car sputtering out in the middle of nowhere. I'd been on my way back from a weekend hike, a solo trip to clear my head, but now I was stranded on this desolate stretch of road surrounded by nothing but endless woods. No streetlights, no other cars, just the dim glow of my hazard lights barely cutting through the darkness. I remember checking my phone. It had 1 bar of service, but every call I tried wouldn't go through. My stomach was a knot of frustration and unease. It was so quiet out there, too quiet, like the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes your skin crawl. About 20 minutes later, just as I was starting to accept that I'd be sleeping in my car, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Relief and dread hit me at the same time. I waved my arms as the truck slowed down, and a man in his late 40s or so leaned out of the window. He looked rugged, unkempt beard, trucker hat, and a tired face. He asked if I needed help, his voice gruff but not exactly friendly. I explained my situation, and he offered me a ride to the nearest gas station, which he claimed was about 15 miles down the road. I hesitated. There was something about him that didn't sit right, but my options were limited. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my backpack and climbed in. The inside of the truck smelled like stale cigarettes and something metallic I couldn't place. The man didn't talk much, which was fine by me. I sat stiffly, clutching my backpack, trying not to breathe too deeply or make too much noise. The hum of the engine was the only sound for a while, but my unease grew as I noticed the gas gauge. It was nearly empty, yet he wasn't slowing down or mentioning it. I asked him if he was sure we'd make it to the station, and he just grunted, his eyes fixed on the road. That's when I realized we weren't heading toward the highway anymore. The road had narrowed, and the trees seemed closer, almost suffocating. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice wavered. He didn't answer at first, then muttered something like, "Shortcut." The word hit me like ice water. My pulse quickened, and I started calculating how far we'd gone and whether I could make it back on foot if I jumped out. I checked the door handle. It wasn't locked, but it felt sticky, like it might jam if I tried to open it fast. The road got rougher, and the truck bounced with every bump. I clung to the door handle, my heart pounding. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but the uneasiness was unbearable. My gut screamed that something was off. Then, he slowed the truck down and muttered, "Gotta check something in the back." Without waiting for me to respond, he pulled over and stepped out, slamming the door behind him. I watched him in the side mirror as he circled to the bed of the truck. He wasn't fiddling with anything back there. Instead, he just stood still, his back to me, his head slightly tilted like he was listening for something. My chest tightened. I couldn't tell if he was stalling or just weird, but either way, I couldn't sit there. My hand crept toward the door handle, ready to bolt, when he suddenly turned and started walking back to my side. His face was blank, but his movements felt deliberate, like he was testing how I'd react. Before I could think, I yanked the door handle and pushed it open. It didn't jam, thank God. I practically fell out of the truck, my legs shaky as I scrambled to my feet. He stopped in his tracks, staring at me like he was sizing me up. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. I stammered something about needing fresh air, but I couldn't look him in the eye. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my body felt frozen. Then I saw it. In the dim beam of the truck's headlights, there was a rope coiled neatly in the bed of the truck, along with a roll of duct tape and what looked like a rusty shovel. My mouth went dry. He noticed me looking and took a step forward, his expression darkening. "Get back in the truck," he said, his voice more forceful this time. My hands shook as I backed away, glancing toward the trees. They were dense, but maybe dense enough to lose him. I knew if I got back in that truck, I wasn't getting out again. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and bolted into the trees, branches snagging at my clothes and scratching my face as I pushed deeper into the woods. Behind me, I heard him yell, his heavy boots crunching on the underbrush as he followed. "You're making this worse for yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My lungs burned as I ran, my legs stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The farther I went, the darker it got, and soon I couldn't even see my own hands in front of me. I thought I was putting distance between us, but then I heard it, the crunch of leaves, closer than before. My heart dropped. How was he so fast? I crouched low, trying to hide, my back pressed against a large tree. I covered my mouth with my hand to muffle my breathing, which felt impossibly loud in the silence. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of a twig, and I couldn't tell if it was him or just my imagination. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the trees, sweeping across the ground. It landed too close to where I was hiding, and I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. The flashlight beam wavered, darting back and forth as his footsteps drew nearer. I pressed myself tighter against the tree, willing myself to disappear. My mind raced, torn between staying hidden and making a break for it. The beam passed by me, barely missing where I crouched, but I didn't dare move. Then, he stopped, just a few feet away. I could hear his breathing now, heavy and angry. "You think you're smart, huh?" he snarled into the darkness. "You're just wasting both our time." My chest tightened, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't respond. I didn't even breathe. For a moment, the silence stretched, and I thought he might move on. But then he took a step closer, so close I could see the outline of his boots. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he'd hear it. I clenched my fists, preparing to spring up and run again, when something happened that I still can't explain. From deeper in the woods, there was a sound, sharp and guttural, like an animal growling, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. The man froze, his flashlight jerking in the direction of the noise. The growling grew louder, echoing through the trees, and it wasn't alone. There were other sounds now, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and what sounded like deep, heavy breathing. Whatever it was coming closer. The man's flashlight beam shook as his hand trembled, his bravado faltering. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice cracking slightly. He aimed the light into the darkness, but it didn't reach far. I could see his confidence unraveling as he took a step back, then another. I didn't wait to find out what was making those noises. While he was distracted, I took my chance and bolted again, darting deeper into the woods. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard him yell, maybe at me, maybe at whatever else was out there, but I didn't look back. I just ran, the sounds of his shouts mingling with those unearthly noises. It was like the forest had come alive, the air buzzing with tension and something I couldn't name. I stumbled over a fallen log, scraping my palms as I hit the ground hard. I bit back a cry and scrambled to my feet, my body screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. As I kept running, the forest seemed to close in around me. The sounds behind me were chaotic now. His frantic yelling, the growls that were louder and more guttural, and something else, a shrill, almost metallic screech that sent chills down my spine. I risked a glance over my shoulder and caught the briefest glimpse of his flashlight beam flailing wildly before it went out. Then came a blood-curdling scream, sharp and desperate, before cutting off completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was thick, oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I slowed down, every part of me trembling, trying to listen over the pounding of my heart. There was nothing. No footsteps, no growling, no voices. Just the wind rustling the trees and my ragged breathing. I wanted to believe he'd given up or that whatever was out there had scared him off, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something had happened to him. I forced myself to keep moving, trying to orient myself in the dark, but everything looked the same. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where the road was or how far I'd gone. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen was cracked from the fall, and it wouldn't turn on. The woods were suffocating now, every shadow twisting into something sinister. I stumbled forward, forcing myself to move even though I had no clue where I was heading. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and the air felt colder than it had before. Then, just as I was sure I couldn't go any farther, I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. It looked like headlights. Relief surged through me, and I pushed toward the light, desperate to reach the road. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't the road. It was the truck. It was parked in a small clearing, its engine off but the headlights still on, casting eerie beams through the fog that had crept into the forest. The driver's side door was wide open, but there was no sign of him. My legs locked up, and I stood frozen, staring at the truck. That's when I noticed the rope and duct tape were gone from the bed. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I couldn't stop the tears that spilled over. How had the truck gotten here? How had I ended up back where I started? Then, from somewhere just beyond the edge of the headlights, there was movement. A shadow, tall and wrong, flickered across the beams, and a low growl rippled through the air. It wasn't him. Whatever it wasn't human. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran again, my legs barely carrying me. The image of that shadow burned into my mind. I don't remember how I made it out of the woods, but hours later, I stumbled onto another road, where a passing car finally stopped to help me. Blockbuster robbery close call. I was 19 back in 2005, working the evening shift at the Blockbuster store in my town. It wasn't a bad gig. Slow nights meant plenty of time to sneak free popcorn and marathon terrible action movies with my coworker Jake. He was a year older than me, the kind of guy who could charm anyone into renting a movie they didn't need. We were practically running the store by ourselves most nights. That particular Wednesday, it was dead quiet. Only 3 people had come in since 7 p.m., and they'd all left without renting anything. Jake had this genius idea to close the store early, an hour before our shift was supposed to end. "It's not like anyone's coming," he said, tossing a bag of half-popped kernels into the trash. I didn't argue. By 10 p.m., the lights were off, the registers were counted, and we were out the door. The parking lot was dimly lit, one of the bulbs flickering in that eerie way that reminded me of horror movies. I remember joking to Jake about how this place would make a perfect slasher film setting. As we locked the doors, I noticed a beat-up sedan idling at the far end of the lot. 2 guys were sitting inside, but it was too dark to make out their faces. "Creepy," I muttered, but Jake brushed it off. Probably just waiting for someone. We didn't stick around to find out. We hopped in Jake's car, cranked up some old Green Day CD, and drove off, laughing about how our manager would never know we ditched early. The next morning, Jake called me, his voice unusually tense. "Dude, have you seen the news?" he asked. I hadn't, but within minutes I was staring at a grainy surveillance photo on the local station. 2 men in ski masks had tried to rob a convenience store barely half a mile from our Blockbuster, around 10:30 p.m., right when we would have been closing. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the timing. The description of their car, a beat-up, dark-colored sedan, sounded way too familiar. "You think it's them?" I asked Jake, even though I already knew his answer. "Who else?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I parked outside the store, I'd scan the lot for that car. Jake said I was paranoid, but even he started double-checking the locks before we left at night. On Friday, we got another slow shift. Around 9 p.m., the bell above the door jingled, and 2 guys walked in. They weren't wearing ski masks, but something about them set off every alarm in my brain. They were dressed in heavy jackets, even though it wasn't that cold, and their faces were completely blank. No smiles, no casual browsing. One of them kept glancing at the counter while the other wandered the aisles, but he wasn't looking at the movies. He was looking at the cameras. I tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking as I pretended to organize the candy shelf by the register. Jake, on the other hand, seemed totally unfazed. "Can I help you guys find anything?" he asked, leaning on the counter like he didn't have a care in the world. The guy near the counter didn't answer, just gave Jake this weird half-smile that sent a chill down my spine. The other one, still pacing the aisles, muttered, "Just looking." But it wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it. Flat, emotionless, like he couldn't care less about being convincing. A minute later, they both stopped moving, like they were waiting for something. I could feel the air change. It was like the store itself was holding its breath. That's when Jake nudged my arm, his voice low. "Call it," he whispered, and I knew exactly what he meant. I reached under the counter for the cordless phone, pretending to fumble with the receipts, and started dialing 911. Before I could finish, the guy at the counter suddenly spoke. "Hey, we're just gonna head out," he said, his voice too casual. I froze, the phone halfway to my ear, as they both walked toward the exit. They didn't rush. They didn't look back. They just left. The second they were out the door, Jake locked it and flipped the open sign to closed. "What the hell was that?" I hissed, my voice shaking. Jake didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring out at the parking lot like he expected them to come back. Finally, he said, "I don't know, but I don't think they were here for DVDs." His calm from earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by this nervous energy that only made me more freaked out. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching their car pull out of the lot and disappear down the street. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to something horrible, again. I kept replaying it in my head. The way they moved, how they looked at the cameras, the tension in the air. It didn't feel random. A week passed, and things went back to normal, at least on the surface. But deep down, I was on edge every time I walked into the store. Jake and I didn't talk about it much, but we started closing exactly on time, no matter how slow the night was. I even started parking closer to the entrance, just in case I needed to make a quick getaway. It wasn't until the following Friday that things escalated. Jake and I were closing up again, the store completely empty, when I noticed headlights pull into the parking lot. I froze, my heart racing as I recognized the car, a dark, beat-up sedan, just like before. "Jake," I whispered, and he turned to look just as two men stepped out of the car. It was them. I didn't need a second look to know it. They didn't head for the entrance right away. Instead, they lingered by their car, talking in low voices. One of them glanced toward the store, his face shadowed under the parking lot's flickering light. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice unusually serious. I didn't argue. He grabbed the keys and motioned for me to follow him to the back door. We slipped into the alley behind the store, the cold air hitting me like a slap. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As we crept toward Jake's car parked around the corner, I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate. I turned to see one of the men rounding the corner, his eyes locking on mine. "Run," Jake hissed, and we both took off like our lives depended on it. We sprinted toward Jake's car, the gravel crunching under our feet, but the guy was fast, too fast. I could hear him closing the distance behind us. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but adrenaline kept me moving. Jake fumbled with his keys as we reached his car, dropping them in his panic. "Hurry," I shouted, glancing over my shoulder. The man was only a few steps away, his face partially lit by the glow of a nearby street lamp. For a second, I thought he was going to catch me. But then, out of nowhere, the sound of a car door slamming broke through the chaos. The second guy had pulled the sedan around the corner, blocking the alley. Jake finally got the door open, and we dove inside, slamming the locks down just as the first man reached us. He pounded on the window with his fist, his face twisted in anger. "Go, go, go," I yelled, and Jake didn't waste a second. He threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as we backed out of the alley and onto the main road. The sedan was right behind us, its headlights glaring in the rear-view mirror. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely buckle my seatbelt. "They're following us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake floored it, weaving through the quiet streets of our town. The sedan stayed on our tail, its engine roaring every time it closed the gap between us. I could see the driver's silhouette in the rearview mirror, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We have to lose them," I said, my voice cracking with panic. Jake didn't answer, too focused on the road. Finally, he swerved onto a side street, taking a sharp turn that nearly sent us into a parked car. The sedan hesitated for a moment, giving us just enough of a lead to make another turn and speed toward the highway. When we reached the main road, the headlights behind us were gone. Jake didn't slow down until we were several miles away, pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. We sat there in silence, our breathing heavy, both of us too shaken to speak. After a few minutes, Jake finally muttered, "We need to call the cops." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what we'd even say. "Hey, two guys in a sedan tried to kill us?" It felt surreal, like something out of one of the horror movies we used to watch during slow shifts. The police took our statement later that night, but nothing ever came of it. They never found the men or the car, and there were no more sightings around the Blockbuster. Jake and I both quit a few weeks later. Neither of us could handle being there at night anymore. Even now, almost 20 years later, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something much worse. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't closed early that first night, or if we hadn't run fast enough the second time. But mostly, I'm just grateful we got away. High school janitor's haunting encounter. I started working as the night janitor at my old high school about a year ago. It was supposed to be an easy gig, cleaning classrooms, waxing the floors, and making sure everything was locked up tight before I clocked out at midnight. The school was always dead quiet at night, which I kind of liked. There was something peaceful about the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of my footsteps in the empty hallways. But last week, something happened that I still can't wrap my head around. I've told myself over and over that there must be a logical explanation, but the more I think about it, the more that explanation slips away. It started around 11 p.m. when I was finishing up the gymnasium. I was mopping the floor near the bleachers when I heard footsteps echoing from the hallway outside. I assumed it was just my coworker Pete, but then I remembered he called out sick that night. The sound wasn't constant either. It was a deliberate, measured pace, like someone taking their time. I stopped mopping and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But there was no reply. For a moment, everything was silent again, and I almost brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. That's when I heard it, a basketball, bouncing slowly. I froze. The sound of the basketball wasn't coming from the gym. It was echoing down the same hallway where I'd heard the footsteps. I walked to the double doors and peered out, but the hallway was empty, dimly lit by the emergency lights. The bouncing sound grew fainter, as if it were rolling further away. I don't know why, but my chest tightened with this strange sense of dread. It felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. Still, I forced myself to step out into the hall, telling myself I just needed to lock up and finish my shift. When I turned the corner toward the source of the noise, my stomach dropped. A basketball sat perfectly still in the middle of the corridor. It shouldn't have been there. The storage closet where the gym equipment is kept was on the other side of the building, and I hadn't even touched the balls that night. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at it, trying to make sense of how it got there. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of someone watching me. The hairs on my neck stood up as a cold breeze swept through the hallway, even though all the windows were closed. I didn't want to be the guy who panics over nothing, so I told myself it was just an air current or maybe some prank left over from the day shift. I grabbed the basketball, intending to take it back to the gym, but as soon as I touched it, I heard a loud clang from down the hall. It sounded like one of the metal lockers slamming shut. My first instinct was to bolt, but instead, I called out again. "Hey, whoever's here, this isn't funny." My voice echoed, but no one answered. My legs felt heavy as I moved toward the lockers, one hand gripping the basketball tighter than I realized. When I reached the locker row, I found nothing out of place. No open doors, no sign of anyone around. But the air felt wrong, stifling, like the building itself was holding its breath. I set the ball down on the floor, half expecting it to roll on its own, but it just stayed there. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the overhead lights started flickering. That was the last straw. I backed away, muttering, "Nope, nope, nope," under my breath, and practically ran back to the gym to grab my things. I was ready to leave for the night, but as I reached for my keys, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My keys weren't on the bench where I'd left them. At first, I thought maybe I'd just misplaced them, so I retraced my steps, checking the gym floor, the bleachers, even the mop bucket. Nothing. That's when I spotted them, lying in the middle of the gym, right under the basketball hoop. But I hadn't been anywhere near the hoop all night. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. I walked over quickly, grabbed the keys, and scanned the room, but I was alone. The building felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on me, urging me to leave. I rushed out of the gym and locked the doors behind me, heading for the main exit. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, following me. When I finally made it to the parking lot, I let out a shaky breath and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But as I was getting into my car, I glanced back at the school. That's when I saw him. A man standing in one of the second-floor windows, staring down at me. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking. I froze, gripping the door of my car, unsure if I should stay or just drive off. He didn't move, just stood there, perfectly still, like a shadow frozen in the window. The rational part of me tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a teacher working late, or maybe even a reflection of something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. My gut told me to get out of there, so I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without looking back. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights trailing me or that man somehow walking down the road. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that the mind can play tricks when you're tired. But when I finally pulled into my driveway, the hairs on my arms stood up again. There, standing on the sidewalk a few houses down, was the same man from the window. He wasn't moving, just staring. My neighborhood is quiet, and it was nearly 1 a.m., so there was no reason for anyone to be out there. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there in my car, watching him, hoping he'd turn and walk away. But he didn't. He just stood there, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something. My hand was shaking as I reached for my phone to call someone. Anyone. But when I looked back up, he was gone. Not walking away, not stepping into the shadows, just gone. The street was empty, and all I could hear was the hum of my car engine. I told myself I must have imagined it, that maybe the stress of the night had finally caught up with me. Still, I wasn't about to take any chances. I ran into my house, locked every door, and double-checked all the windows. I even left a few lights on, something I never do. I sat on the couch, trying to calm my nerves, but every little sound outside made my heart jump. I kept replaying everything in my head, the footsteps, the basketball, the man in the window. None of it made sense, but it felt connected, like it wasn't random. The strangest part? When I woke up the next morning, one of my house keys was missing from the ring. That missing key sent a chill through me. I tore the house apart looking for it, checking under furniture, inside drawers, even retracing my steps from the night before. But it was nowhere to be found. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it had been taken. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the knot in my stomach refused to go away. I called the school that afternoon to let them know I wouldn't be coming in for my next shift. I didn't care if they thought I was flaking. I needed a break, at least for a couple of nights. But even staying home didn't help. That evening, as the sun set, the same oppressive feeling I'd felt in the school started creeping into my house. I kept glancing at the windows, convinced I'd see him standing outside. The silence in the house felt unnatural, heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. At one point, I swore I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the front porch. I didn't dare look. I just sat there, clutching a kitchen knife, and waited. The footsteps never came closer, but the sound lingered, like someone pacing back and forth on the porch. I was too scared to check, but after what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I stayed frozen on the couch, my heart pounding, waiting for something else to happen. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, the porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I ended up sleeping with the lights on that night, or trying to sleep, at least. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on the porch, right in the middle of the welcome mat, was the missing key from my keyring. It was spotless, as if it had just been polished, even though it had rained overnight. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Someone had been in my house, or at least had the ability to get in. I called a locksmith immediately and changed every single lock in the house. It's been a week since then, and nothing else has happened. But every time I lock my door at night, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, watching. Road trip pursuit. I was on a solo road trip last fall, driving down a stretch of highway that felt endless. You know those roads, barely any cars, just the hum of your engine and the same tired landscape stretching for miles. It was nearing dusk, and the sky had that orange-purple hue that always makes you feel like you're in a movie. I'd been driving for hours and was planning to stop at a motel in the next town. My phone signal was spotty, and my GPS had frozen on the last route update, but I wasn't too worried. I'd been relying on road signs anyway, and everything seemed straightforward. That was until I noticed the black Jeep. At first, I didn't think much of it. It pulled out of a gas station and merged onto the highway a few cars behind me. But after 20 or 30 minutes, it felt off. Every time I changed lanes or adjusted my speed, the Jeep did the same. I tested it out, slowing down a bit to let it pass, but it just lingered behind me. Even when I sped up to leave it behind, it would eventually catch up. My stomach started to knot, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe we were just coincidentally heading in the same direction. But then the Jeep flashed its high beams, and I knew this wasn't random. The high beams stayed on for a good 30 seconds, glaring into my mirrors and practically blinding me. I was gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, but I kept my focus forward, pretending I didn't notice. Maybe they just wanted me to move over? So, I shifted into the right lane, letting them pass if they wanted. But they didn't. The Jeep moved over too, matching my lane change perfectly. That's when the panic really set in. I could feel my chest tightening, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Whoever was driving that Jeep was playing with me, and I had no idea why. I debated pulling over, but something about the way they were driving made that feel like a terrible idea. Instead, I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. My old sedan groaned, but I managed to push it past 80, then 90. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. The road ahead was empty, and my mirrors showed nothing but fading daylight behind me. I almost laughed at how worked up I'd gotten. But just as I started to breathe again, the Jeep reappeared out of nowhere, flying up behind me like a predator closing in on its prey. This time, they didn't just stay back. They started tailgating me, so close I thought they'd clip my bumper. I could feel my heart in my throat as the Jeep kept riding my bumper, swerving slightly as if to taunt me. My brain was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I slam the brakes? Call for help? But my phone was useless without a signal, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke them into doing something worse. Suddenly, they jerked to the left, pulling up beside me in the next lane. That's when I finally got a good look at the driver, or at least, I tried to. The windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see anything but a vague outline. No face, no expression. Just a shadow sitting there, as if the Jeep itself was alive and playing with me. Then they swerved back into my lane, cutting me off so sharply that I had to slam my brakes to avoid crashing. My tires screeched, the whole car shaking violently as I fought to keep control. My chest was heaving, and I could feel sweat dripping down my temples. The Jeep slowed down in front of me, forcing me to drop my speed to a crawl. I was stuck behind them now, completely boxed in with no way to escape. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body felt frozen, locked in this surreal nightmare on the highway. And that's when their brake lights flicked on, bright and blinding, forcing me to stop completely in the middle of the empty road. For a moment, everything was still. The Jeep sat motionless in front of me, its brake lights casting an eerie red glow across the asphalt. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely keep my grip on the steering wheel. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew I had to get out of there. Before I could think twice, I threw my car into reverse, glancing over my shoulder to make sure the road was clear. As I started to back up, the Jeep's reverse lights came on too. My stomach dropped. They weren't just watching me, they were mimicking my every move. I slammed on the brakes again, my mind racing for options. That's when the Jeep's door opened. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but I caught a glimpse of a figure stepping out, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't run toward me or shout, they just stood there, partially silhouetted by their own headlights, like they were waiting for me to make the next move. My instincts kicked in, and I threw the car into drive, swerving hard into the other lane to get around them. My tires skidded, and for a terrifying second, I thought I was going to lose control. But somehow, I managed to straighten out and floor it, speeding past the Jeep and leaving them behind. I didn't dare look back, my focus locked on the road ahead as I pushed my car to its limits. My entire body was shaking, but adrenaline kept me going. After a few minutes of driving, I started to believe I'd lost them. The road behind me was dark and empty, and there was no sign of the Jeep in my mirrors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't far. Every shadow on the side of the highway looked like their headlights. Every distant glint of metal made my heart race. I kept my speed up, praying I'd hit a town or a gas station soon, somewhere with lights, people, anything. But just as I began to feel the tiniest bit safer, my stomach dropped. Headlights appeared in the distance behind me, rapidly growing brighter. It was them. I didn't know how they'd caught up so fast, but they were closing in, faster than before. This time, the Jeep didn't stay behind me for long. They veered into the other lane and pulled up alongside me, matching my speed. I glanced over, my breath catching in my throat. The driver's window was still rolled up, and I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence, heavy and hostile. It was like they were daring me to react, waiting for me to make a mistake. I gritted my teeth and kept my eyes forward, refusing to give them the reaction they seemed to want. My hands were slick on the wheel, and my shoulders were tense to the point of pain, but I knew I couldn't let them intimidate me into panicking. Suddenly, the Jeep swerved toward me, jerking into my lane like they were trying to sideswipe my car. I instinctively yanked the wheel to the right, my tires barely clinging to the edge of the pavement as I fought to stay on the road. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, and a primal fear started to take over. Whoever was driving that Jeep wasn't just messing with me, they were trying to hurt me. With no other choice, I sped up again, forcing my car to go faster than I'd ever pushed it before. The engine whined in protest, but I couldn't stop. I needed to lose them, no matter what it took. Up ahead, I spotted an exit ramp, a narrow curve leading to what looked like a smaller road. It wasn't ideal, but it was my best shot. I yanked the wheel and took the exit without signaling, hoping the sharp turn would throw them off. My tires screeched, and the car wobbled dangerously, but I managed to stay on the road. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the Jeep overshoot the exit, barreling down the highway past me. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. I knew they could double back at any moment. The new road was pitch black, flanked by trees on both sides, with no streetlights or signs of life. My high beams barely cut through the darkness, but I didn't dare slow down. I just kept driving, hoping to find a town or even a single house where I could stop and feel safe. Every crunch of gravel under my tires sounded deafening in the silence, and my paranoia was through the roof. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see the Jeep's headlights reappear at any moment. But the road stayed empty, and for the first time all night, I started to believe it might actually be over. Then I saw it. Parked at the edge of a clearing, just barely visible in the glow of my headlights, was the black Jeep. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively slammed on the brakes. My car skidded to a stop, and I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How the hell had they gotten ahead of me? The Jeep's engine wasn't running, and its headlights were off, but I knew it was the same one. It was just sitting there, waiting. I couldn't see anyone inside, but that almost made it worse. My mind was racing with possibilities. Had they abandoned the Jeep? Were they hiding in the woods? I didn't know what to do. I felt completely trapped, like a rabbit caught in a snare. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but the road was narrow, and backing out into the pitch-black darkness felt just as dangerous as staying. I forced myself to move, gripping the wheel with trembling hands as I inched my car forward, trying to keep as much distance from the Jeep as possible. My headlights passed over it, and I scanned every inch, looking for movement or any sign of the driver. Nothing. Just that eerie, empty vehicle sitting there like a trap. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As I crept past, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. They were barely visible, shrouded in shadows, but I knew it was them. They weren't moving, just standing there, completely still, as if they knew I'd see them. My chest tightened, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel the malice radiating from them. I didn't wait to see what they'd do. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning on loose gravel before finally catching. My car lurched forward, and I sped down the road, heart pounding, praying I wouldn't see that Jeep or that figure again. The road twisted and turned, and I didn't let up on the gas until I was certain I'd put miles between me and that Jeep. But even as the road straightened out and the trees thinned, my fear didn't ease. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. My phone finally buzzed with a faint signal, and I almost cried with relief. I called the first number I could think of, my dad's, and blurted out everything. He told me to find a gas station, somewhere with people, and stay there until he could figure out how to help. Just hearing his voice made me feel a little safer, but I wasn't out of this yet. About 20 minutes later, I spotted a gas station lit up like a beacon in the darkness. It wasn't much, a single pump and a tiny convenience store, but it was the first sign of civilization I'd seen in miles. I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and locked my doors. My hands were still shaking as I sat there, trying to calm down and piece together what had just happened. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed a faint sound, a low, rumbling engine. My heart stopped. I turned to look at the highway, and sure enough, there it was, the black Jeep, crawling past the gas station, slow and deliberate. They didn't pull in. They didn't stop. They just drove by, disappearing into the night like a bad dream. But I swear, even now, I could feel their eyes on me.